The difference between what we imagine as successful or powerful or influential and what God intends for us is as difficult for us to understand and follow today as it was for the disciples. It is a radical reorientation of the way we live in the world and the way we relate to one another. But in those moments that we can make it happen, we are transformed, and the kingdom is just a bit closer. Our passages today offer two examples of the traps that are so easy for us to fall into. But when we hear the good news and let it transform and pour forth from us, we move ever closer to the kingdom of God. So let's start with Proverbs 31, which in my translation of the Bible is given the subheading, Ode to a Capable Wife. Now, for a woman my age, living in middle America, this passage immediately tells me that I do not measure up to those women. You know, the stereotypical wife and mother with a fulfilling career who has everything together, including a perfectly decorated home, neat, clean, well-behaved children, a fairy tale marriage, a Starbucks in her hand in the school pickup line, and a balanced dinner on the table at 6 o'clock that her children happily eat, all while looking perfectly put together, excelling at work, and never breaking a sweat, except in Pilates class, which she never misses. And she also never has very real, very human moments, in public anyway. Those are the things that the messaging the world gives women from this passage. It's what many of us have been taught the capable wife or woman is, or at the very least, it's what we have internalized from this reading and the culture we live in. But at its core, this passage sings the praises not of the perfect woman, but of the virtues of wisdom. Wisdom, that which sustains, endures, that is what matters. Wisdom includes virtues like mutual support, empowerment, integrity, trust, sharing with others, and most especially, obedience to God. And those heavenly values, those are things we can all live into to be the best versions of ourselves. If you go back and read this passage again later, you will read that wisdom is hardworking, thoughtful, fair, brave, kind. And living into those values means that sometimes your family has popcorn for dinner and you're wearing yesterday's clothes because you've spent the day at the bedside of an ailing parent or fighting to make your community just a little bit better for everyone. Those are the things that God asks of us. That is power and influence in God's kingdom. Care for community and one another. Not an unattainable image of what social media tells us is a capable woman, but instead, someone who serves others thoughtfully, willingly, with open arms, reaching out to those in need, filled with laughter, joy, and awe in the face of God. That is a woman who is wise in the eyes of heaven, and the kind of woman I want to become. But gentlemen, you are not left out of the competing values of heaven and earth either. And we see this in the gospel passage. Jesus overhears the disciples arguing, and he asks them what they were arguing about. They're silent. embarrassed to tell him that they are arguing about which of them was the greatest disciple, the most loved, the most powerful, the favored. A precursor, if you will, to the soon-to-come request from James and John to sit at Jesus' right and left hand. And this argument comes just after Jesus tells the disciples for the second time that he will be betrayed and killed. And Mark tells us that they did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask. Really, who can blame them? I mean, Peter had recently declared that Jesus was the Messiah, and Jesus had sternly warned them all not to tell anyone. Peter, James, and John had recently experienced the Transfiguration. Their suspicions had been confirmed. Jesus was the Messiah. The disciples knew that they were following the expected and longed-for king who they had been taught would save them all from Roman rule, ushering in a new kingdom and the restoration of Israel. But what Jesus was telling the disciples in private was that he would be killed. And this was not a concept they could understand or even fathom. The disciples believed in the faithfulness of God, and they lived in a culture of imperial power. Power and privilege were what were respected and revered. We see this all throughout the New Testament. Where you sat at dinner showed your status. Who the disciples wanted to allow near Jesus, or more specifically, who they tried to keep away from Jesus, showed who had value in this society. The expectation was that the Messiah would soon reveal himself to be a powerful king with a force that would vanquish their enemies. And yet Jesus keeps telling them that he will be put to death. And not just any death, but one filled with rejection, betrayal, suffering. This was inconceivable to them. So much so that even after hearing it repeatedly from their teacher, they continued to argue amongst themselves over who was the greatest. They really did not understand what type of Messiah God had sent and what he was here to teach. And they certainly did not expect what was to come. But in this moment, Jesus asked the disciples what they were arguing about, and they didn't answer. But you can tell from what comes next that Jesus knew exactly what they were discussing, and he had thoughts. Jesus tells the disciples that to be the first, or the greatest, or truly powerful, one must be a servant, and not just any servant, the lowest of the servants, the one who served at table and ate only after everyone else had their fill. He goes even farther and compares himself and God to children who arguably had no standing in society. In Christianity today, the idea of being a servant to all is held up as the ideal, something we should all strive to be. But in Jesus' day, it was incomprehensible to imagine a servant as leader. So it's no wonder the disciples were afraid to ask Jesus to expand on his impending death. The message he was giving was completely countercultural to the society in which they lived. They wanted their Messiah to be a strong warrior, someone who would fight for them, someone they could look up to. And Jesus tells them they had it completely wrong. And that message is still countercultural today, because hearing and believing this message and living our lives that way is as radical today as it was when Jesus said it. We're just used to hearing it on Sundays and then trying in our own way to follow the message while also living our regular lives and keeping up with our neighbors. We wholeheartedly believe Jesus, but the world we live in messages the exact opposite of the idea of servanthood. Because it's not that we all don't want to serve, but it's hard. It's hard to be a servant. Because reverence for power and wealth is in the air that we breathe. And it's likely we don't even notice how often it creeps into our lives. We look up to the rich and powerful. We seek happiness in the products they advertise. We wear the clothes they sell. We drive the cars they like and decorate our homes with the furniture they suggest. We compare our lives to theirs and try to be a part of their social orbits. We assign more value to the thoughts and opinions of those in power, and we forget the message of Jesus. So, fortunately, we have James, who comes in to remind us where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will be disorder and wickedness of every kind. The wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality. Our honor, our worth, our value, and in fact, true power in this world and in the kingdom of God comes not from the company we keep, the things we own, or the jobs we have. Our power comes from our ability to love and serve. That is how we change the world. We can reorient our lives and truly follow the countercultural, radical Jesus who rejects mass consumption, cares for the least among us, rejects the power that the world offers, and seeks only to serve. That Jesus is the one who will bring life and peace to our lives and those around us if we let him change us. If we too reject the messages we receive on the daily about what to buy, who to like, who to follow, and instead find ways to follow Jesus into the hospitals, shelters, youth centers, and prisons. We continue to support our cathedral neighbors with sack lunches and clothes, toiletries and non-perishables, meeting and serving our newest neighbors through Top City Promise, providing support, and more importantly, fellowship opportunities, listening to those we are serving, hearing them when they tell us what they need, inviting their opinions on change in our community, and then working for that change through our justice ministry opportunities, offering ourselves and our gifts to people and in places where we may be uncomfortable, and seeing how the world can be changed, not to keep the powerful in charge, but only to serve one another. Because that is what the Jesus we follow modeled for us, to the cross and beyond. It's what he asks of us, so that by our good lives, filled with works done with gentleness born of wisdom, we may discover and spread the very good news of the radical love of Christ in this world.